Welcome back to Biz Today. Before the break, we were speaking with our special guest in studio, Verlie Oosthuizen, who's a partner at Shepston & Wiley, specializing in social media law. Now, we chatted about social media law in the first part of our interview. Now we want to focus on the Protection of Personal Information Act that's upcoming.
Yes.
Please introduce us to the Act.
Okay. Data protection and the protection of personal information is something that is very important in other jurisdictions. This has been around for a long time. Australia introduced this kind of legislation as early as 1995 or 1997. The European Union has this kind of legislation, and basically it's looking after people's personal data. So their names, their social security numbers if they're in America, their ID numbers in South Africa, anything to do with the personal information of a particular individual, their address, their telephone number. This is because people have a very, very big interest in personal information, or companies have a big interest in it because it actually provides revenue. If you have got somebody's telephone number, then it means you can call them and you can sell them your wares. If you've got somebody's ID, it's possible to get a whole lot of information about them. Anything that could lead them to be able to sell them something. Advertisers use all of this kind of information all of the time. And so it became important in other jurisdictions for you to protect that information because people were getting upset about their personal information being sold, sometimes for nefarious purposes, sometimes for irritating purposes like direct marketing.
Sure.
So South Africa has been quite slow in introducing the legislation because we've obviously had different priorities. But it's come to the stage where if people are wanting to do business or inter-country kind of business, so if you've got a company that's in America and they want to do business with a company in South Africa, or a company in Europe and they want to do business with a company in South Africa, they need to have a safe way of transmitting data to one another without leaking that information. And that's why this legislation has come into place, because in the European Union, for example, companies have to make sure that any data of any of the people there, if it's transferred to another country, it's safe and it isn't going to be used for nefarious purposes.
Has some of the parts of this Act been passed already, or is it still in discussion?
Yes, it has. It actually was passed in 2013, but only certain sections of it. And those sections were the ones that were dealing with the definitions and dealing with the setting up of the Information Regulator's Office. Now, unfortunately, that's as far as it's got at this stage. There has been an information regulator that has been appointed in September, and then all of the people that were part of the Information Regulator's Office were appointed in the beginning of December. In January,
very recent.
Yeah, very, very recent. In January, I know that the Minister of Justice met with the Information Regulator to discuss how they were going to be setting up the office, to discuss the support that the Information Regulator needed, but we haven't got further than that, and we don't actually know when the full Act is going to commence.
I know, and again, I'm thinking about the Durban Chamber presentation that you did. We were talking about what the Information Regulator will focus on first.
Yes.
And she'll focus on taking information without consent, if I got this right, and selling that off so that people can be targeted for direct marketing.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that?
That those kind of issues are going to be dealt with and tackled first.
Yeah.
That direct marketing is quite a big problem in South Africa. People sell on lists, and it's a way that a lot of people do business, and it's understandable because you do get a lot of information and people can phone you in an unsolicited manner. In the Consumer Protection Act, I mean, there is protection for people from direct marketing, but it seems that this act is also going to be targeting that, and it's going to, we think that the Information Regulator is going to clamp down a bit on people selling on lists of their customers to other companies for huge amounts of money so that they can sell on their wares. You
mentioned, I know in the presentation, that marketers will have the hardest time from all the components in an organization with the introduction of the Protection of Personal Information Act, because it directs you on what kind of information you can solicit,
Yes.
and how you need to protect that information, and obviously to get rid of it at some stage.
Yes.
Can you take us through that thought pattern of what needs to happen with information?
Well, we like to think of it in terms of an information life cycle. So when you take in the information, you use the information, you store the information, and then you destroy the information. So you've got to make sure that at each stage of the information life cycle, you are protecting that information from being used in another way that it's not supposed to be used. If somebody is giving you their information, they are consenting, or if you've received consent to have their information, you've got to make sure that that consent, that they were informed, that they were willing, and that they knew what that information was going to be used for. There's nothing worse than having your information used and then somebody else is using it to phone you 10 million times about a product that you don't want to have, and you never consented to them having it in the first place. So it's making sure that when people are giving you information, you're looking after that properly. Now, what happens often in marketing departments, and I don't want to generalize completely,
Of course.
but they want to hold on to as much information as possible because information is power. And it means that they can look at different target groups, they can look at different trends and analyze those trends, but sometimes they hold on to far too much information. Now, if you de-identify information, and that means you separate the information out so that you can't actually tell who the particular person is, then it isn't subject to POPI. And then those kinds, and when I say POPI, that's Protection of Personal Information Act. But it isn't subject to that act. If it's de-identified, then you don't have to have all of these special protection measures in place. So it is far more useful for a marketing department to get the information and then de-identify it so that they can use it without having to comply with POPI.
Because I know I also asked you the question previously about small businesses taking an active role in making sure that they comply with the act.
Yes.
And it was a pretty straightforward answer, but it's so it's very evident in daily lives of entrepreneurs that they may miss that kind of thinking.
Yes.
Please advise our small entrepreneurs how they can effectively enact this.
Well, it's going to have to be an everyday mindset. It's got to become a complete habit, that you know that when you are gathering information, you're going to have to protect that information. It doesn't have to be a very, very expensive way of dealing with information, but there is this kind of a movement or this kind of theory of thinking called privacy by design, which means that at every stage of the information life cycle and every part of your business, you are trying to ensure that people's information is protected and that everything is kept private. It doesn't mean that you have to have a very fancy computer system. It might be as simple as just putting files away in a filing cabinet and locking that filing cabinet so that you know that everything is secure. The point of this is that every single business is going to be subject to POPI. Every single person is subject to POPI. So if you are a small business or entrepreneur, if you are holding any information about anyone or any company, you need to make sure that that information is secure, and you need to follow the clauses of the Act.
I know you mentioned that ID numbers
Yes.
are something that are very, very useful,
Very useful.
to marketers,
Very
and don't
useful.
give them out.
Very useful to criminals too, unfortunately.
How do you, I've had marketers just call me, and stupidly enough, sometimes I do give my ID number out, not
Yes.
thinking of the repercussions.
Yes.
But you're able to say no to them.
Yes, definitely. Say no, especially when people are asking your ID number. Unless you are phoning in and you are trying to get information out of, say, a medical aid or your bank or anything of that nature, then you obviously have the onus and you decide that you're going to give them that information. But if people phone you and they ask you for that kind of information, then I would advise that you don't give it out.
How should we as entrepreneurs keep up to date with changes in legislation around information? Because the basis of any business is information. That's what we deal with, data,
Yes.
on a daily basis.
Yes, exactly.
Larger companies may employ sophisticated security systems to manage the data in the cloud, and then obviously destroy that after some stage.
Yes.
And the whole idea of consent. So how do we keep ourselves abreast? Do we read? Do we continually engage with a legal expert like yourself? What do we do as small businesses? Because I'd like small businesses to understand how they can empower themselves in terms of keeping abreast?
I think with these kind of pieces of legislation, you are going to be hearing about them in the media, and you should be keeping up to date with these kind of issues. It's almost like labor legislation where you have to comply. You don't have a choice, like with the Basic Conditions of Employment Act or the Labour Relations Act. So you've got to keep abreast of the current affairs, you've got to keep abreast of whether the act is in place, and then it's getting people that are experts to maybe advise you, not every single day, but maybe sit down and do an exercise with you of what you need to do, and then having a checklist or having a small audit of the kind of information that you're holding on to, how long you need to hold on to it for, and then when you can destroy it. And then it becomes a part of your everyday existence.
So it's well worth the investment getting in a legal expert to consult with you.
Yes.
So that you can apply those practices. And obviously as the business grows, then your need for legal consultation grows as well.
Exactly, rather than dealing with some kind of a fine or liability if you haven't been following it and the information regulator has come in.
100%. So before we wrap up what's been such an interesting conversation, and I'm confident we're going to have you back in the studio to talk both labor law and more about the Protection of Personal Information Act, the idea of consent. Can you briefly tell our viewers, just to wrap up, why we are asking for that consent with information? I'm an entrepreneur, I go to a client, I need certain kind of information from them. And what does that consent mean to me when it's in my possession?
Okay. With consent, you have to be slightly careful. You don't ask just for a blanket consent so that you can keep the information, because if you do that, then it means you have to maintain that consent and make sure that that consent is up to date. If a client wants to do business with you and wants to enter into a contract with you, they're going to have to provide you with certain information in order for that contract to take place. For example, if somebody orders something online and they want a gift to get delivered to their house, they have to provide their address, otherwise the contract isn't going to take place. And you don't need specific consent for that. Also, if it's in terms of some kind of legislation, you don't need specific consent for that if you're asking them for that information and you are required to get it. But if you want information and it isn't in terms of an act and it isn't in terms of a contract, you need to get consent for it. It has to be informed consent. They have to know exactly what they're consenting to. It has to be specific. They have to know that they're not going to have their information sold on. And they also have to do something. They have to show a positive action that they're giving you the consent. So if it was ticking a box or unticking a box, they are actually physically doing that. If you are speaking to them on the phone and they're providing that information, they are actually physically giving you the consent. But that's something that you have to maintain, and if they decide that they want to withdraw their consent, then you have to get rid of that information.
I took away so many points today, which I know we can explore further because it's such a large conversation to have. But it is around good business practice in terms of process within the business, but also understanding the legislation and just possibly getting that 1 hour, 2 hour legal consultation to understand how the act impacts your business. And I'm really glad that we were able to have this conversation today. It's just the beginning of many more. So thank you so much, Verlie, for coming on to Biz Today.
Pleasure.
Wonderful. We've been speaking with Verlie Oosthuizen, who is the partner at Shepston & Wiley, heading up the social media law department, specializing in that. I know this has been a rather interesting conversation for you, and we'll be sure to get Verlie back on future episodes to continue the conversation on what is now becoming one of the biggest pieces of legislation, or legislation that will impact us because we use technology every day and also we communicate in such a manner. If you'd like to get in touch with Biz Today, find us on Facebook, we're Biz Today, and on Twitter at BizToday_ZA. Any questions or queries you have for me, naz@sociallyacceptable.co.za. Until next week, goodbye.